to meet with the Iranians. The president says it's not worth his people making the 18-hour flight when he says we have all the cards. He also told me the Iranians can call.
A major diplomatic development has emerged in the ongoing tensions involving the United States, Iran, and the wider region, after President Donald Trump made clear that he is no longer willing to send senior American officials abroad for talks he believes are unlikely to produce meaningful results. According to the latest information, President Trump said he had unilaterally canceled the planned trip by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to Pakistan, where they were expected to meet with the Iranians. Trump's message was blunt. He said it was not worth sending his people on what he described as an 18-hour flight, when, in his view, the United States already holds the advantage. He also said the Iranians are free to call at any time if they want to talk. That decision appears to mark a sharp shift in expectations surrounding what had been seen as a possible second round of peace talks. For days, there had been signs that diplomatic movement was still possible. The understanding earlier in the week was that the U.S. side was ready and willing to travel, and that Pakistan could serve as a meeting point for a new attempt at direct engagement. There had even been indications that vice president-level participation was possible, if conditions came together. But those expectations now appear to have collapsed, at least for the moment. The sense before this latest announcement was that another round of talks might still materialize after the White House signaled that Iran had asked for an in-person meeting. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt had said that Iran wanted face-to-face discussions and that the administration was sending a delegation to Pakistan. That statement had raised hopes that quiet diplomacy was still alive behind the scenes. But President Trump's latest remarks suggest Washington has now stepped back from that process, deciding that another trip is not justified unless Tehran shows greater seriousness. At the same time, there are signs that diplomatic communication may still be moving through indirect channels. The Pakistani Prime Minister's office has confirmed that Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi met with the Iranian delegation and discussed what it described as the current regional situation. While the wording was broad, it strongly suggests that the ongoing conflict and the future of negotiations were central to the conversation. That has fueled speculation that Iran may be using Pakistan as an intermediary, passing messages through Islamabad in the hope that they will eventually reach Washington. If that is the case, then Pakistan's role may now become even more important. Rather than hosting a formal direct encounter between American and Iranian officials, Pakistan could instead become the key backchannel through which proposals, warnings, and conditions are relayed. In moments of deep mistrust, these indirect lines often become the only available mechanism for testing whether any common ground still exists. And at this stage, mistrust appears to define the entire process. One of the biggest sticking points remains Iran's nuclear program, especially the question of uranium enrichment. The United States has made clear that it wants Iran to give up any path that could eventually lead to a nuclear weapon. President Trump has been unequivocal on that point, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has echoed the same demand, insisting that Iran will not be allowed to possess a nuclear weapon. But from the Iranian side, the language remains defiant. Iran's ambassador to India posted that negotiations can only lead to a proper outcome if Iran's adversaries recognize what he called the nation's right to the peaceful use of nuclear energy. That statement is highly significant because it suggests Tehran is still determined to defend enrichment as a sovereign right, even while facing intense military and economic pressure. For the United States, that position is unacceptable if it leaves Iran with the capability to move closer to weaponization. For Iran, abandoning enrichment altogether could be seen as surrender. That is why this issue continues to sit at the heart of the impasse. Another major dispute centers on whether Iran would ever allow enriched uranium to be removed from its territory. From Washington's perspective, removing enriched material would be one of the clearest ways to limit Iran's ability to rapidly advance its nuclear program. But from Tehran's perspective, allowing a foreign power to remove such material could amount to admitting defeat and handing over one of its few remaining bargaining chips. So even when both sides speak of negotiations, they appear to be operating from fundamentally incompatible starting points. The collapse of the planned Pakistan meeting also highlights a broader conclusion taking shape in Washington: that diplomacy, at least in its recent form, may have reached its limit. That view has been reinforced by voices arguing that Iran is not engaging from a position of compromise, but from a position of tactical delay. One assessment from the American side is that Iranian officials have come to the table with more complaints than concrete proposals, and that, rather than opening a real path toward a ceasefire or settlement, they have tried to regain leverage after losing ground. That argument leads directly to the next phase of US thinking, which appears to rely not only on diplomacy, but on pressure. Military pressure, economic pressure, and strategic pressure in the waterways that matter most. One of the most sensitive points in the region remains the straits and surrounding sea lanes. The American view increasingly seems to be that Iran's strongest remaining leverage lies in its ability to threaten or disrupt maritime transit. If that is true, then the US response is likely to focus on demonstrating that Iran does not control access through those waters and cannot successfully use shipping threats as a bargaining tool. That is where the military buildup comes in. American naval assets are moving into the Persian Gulf and surrounding region, and attention is now turning to the kinds of threats Iran can still pose at sea. Although Iran's conventional naval strength may have been badly weakened, officials and analysts remain focused on smaller, fast-moving boats that could be used for harassment, disruption, or even mine-laying operations. These fast boats have long been part of Iran's asymmetric strategy. They may not be able to destroy a major tanker outright in a conventional battle, but they can create uncertainty, raise insurance rates, trigger panic, and complicate commercial transit. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has warned that if there are reckless attempts to lay more mines, the United States will respond. He described such actions as a violation of the ceasefire and made clear that Washington is prepared to deal with them. His remarks suggest that the Pentagon is treating even limited Iranian naval harassment as a serious strategic issue, not as a nuisance. The concern is not only about physical damage, it is also about perception. Even a small number of incidents involving mines or fast boats can make shipping companies more cautious, drive up costs, and project the image that Iran still has meaningful power to choke the flow of commerce. That is why the American position now appears to emphasize visible control and visible deterrence. The objective is not simply to protect individual vessels, but to send a message to insurers, markets, and foreign governments that shipping routes remain under American protection. There is growing confidence in Washington that the United States has had the capability from the start to identify and neutralize these smaller threats. Supporters of the current military posture argue that modern surveillance, rapid response systems, and the presence of marine forces can make it much harder for Iran's small boats to operate effectively. There is also emphasis on the option of placing Marines aboard US-flagged vessels. With armed personnel on board, any Iranian craft approaching too closely could be confronted much more directly. The goal, in this view, is to make clear that harassment will not be tolerated and that maritime traffic will continue under American-backed security. There is also a financial dimension to this strategy. If the United States can convincingly show that shipping is protected, insurance costs may begin to stabilize or fall. That would weaken one of Iran's key pressure points. Earlier periods of strong American naval presence were seen by some as having already reduced Tehran's leverage in this area. The belief now is that the same formula may need to be applied again, only more forcefully. But military pressure is only one half of the picture. The other half is economic pressure. And increasingly, officials and analysts are pointing to energy markets as the arena where Iran may be most vulnerable. the United States has signaled that it is now going after Iran's oil network in China. That matters enormously because China has been one of the key destinations for Iranian oil, including shipments moved through what is often described as a dark fleet of sanctioned or obscured vessels. If Washington can disrupt that flow more effectively, the pressure on Tehran could intensify dramatically. Those backing the strategy argue that this is where sanctions and blockade-style measures could begin to change the equation. If Iran loses revenue from oil sales, it loses one of the main sources of funding that sustains its regime and its regional activities. And if China feels the economic consequences of disrupted supply, Beijing may in turn pressure Tehran to de-escalate or accept terms it previously rejected. In that sense, the strategy is designed to work on multiple levels at once. Directly, it squeezes the Iranian regime by reducing its export capacity. Indirectly, it forces major buyers, especially China, to reconsider how much strategic risk they are willing to absorb in order to keep Iranian oil flowing. Some in Washington believe that China's dependence on those shipments could actually become a tool against Iran, because Beijing may have stronger reasons than anyone else to demand stability if its own economy is affected. Supporters of this pressure campaign argue that American energy can fill part of the gap, strengthening U.S. trade relationships while weakening reliance on countries seen as hostile or unstable. In that reading, the policy is not simply punitive. It is also intended to reshape energy dependence in a direction favorable to the United States and its allies. Still, all of this raises a deeper question. Who exactly is making decisions inside Iran? That remains one of the most uncertain parts of the entire crisis. There have been reports suggesting internal divisions, including claims that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps may have pushed Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf out of the negotiating process. President Trump himself has repeatedly said that Iran's leadership is divided and that there is significant infighting. Yet public messaging from Iranian officials tells a different story. Ghalibaf pushed back strongly, writing that in Iran there are no radicals or moderates, only Iranians and revolutionaries. He said the nation and government are united in complete obedience to the supreme leader, and vowed that the aggressor would regret its actions. That statement was clearly intended to project unity, discipline, and continuity of command. But even such statements can reveal the pressure a system is under. Governments tend to insist on unity most strongly when questions about internal division are already circulating. The reality may be that multiple power centers inside Iran are trying to shape the response to the current crisis. The clerical establishment, the Revolutionary Guard, the Parliament, the Foreign Ministry, and broader political factions may all be influencing events in different ways. That does not necessarily mean the system is collapsing, but it may mean decision-making is slower, more conflicted, and less predictable than it appears from the outside. Some observers argue that the regime represents only a fraction of the broader population, and that many Iranians are deeply frustrated with the theocratic system under which they have lived for decades. In that interpretation, any fracture inside the ruling structure could eventually create space for domestic political change. Others warn that external pressure can sometimes produce the opposite effect, allowing the regime to rally nationalist sentiment and tighten internal control. For now, what is clear is that Washington does not seem willing to moderate its approach simply because the command structure inside Iran is murky. The American calculation appears to be that uncertainty inside Tehran is not a reason to hold back, but rather evidence that pressure should be maintained until a coherent and serious negotiating position emerges. That brings the story back to President Trump's decision to cancel the trip to Pakistan. His remarks were short, but they carried a broader strategic message. He was not just rejecting one flight or one meeting. He was signaling that the United States no longer sees symbolic travel or open-ended discussions as useful. unless Iran is ready to act from a position of seriousness. In his words, the United States has all the cards. And if Iran wants to talk, it knows how to make contact. That is a message aimed at multiple audiences at once. It is aimed at Tehran, to show impatience with delay. It is aimed at intermediaries, such as Pakistan, to indicate that back-channel diplomacy can continue, but will not be indulged endlessly. It is aimed at American allies, to reassure them that Washington believes it remains in control of escalation. And it is aimed at domestic audiences, reinforcing the idea that the United States will not chase negotiations for their own sake. For Pakistan, the cancellation presents both a setback and an opportunity. On one hand, a direct role in high-level talks would have elevated Islamabad's diplomatic importance. On the other hand, if Pakistan becomes a trusted messenger between two hostile sides, its role could still prove essential. Much will depend on whether Iranian officials use Pakistan merely to pass rhetorical positions, or whether they are willing to send something more substantive through that channel. For Iran, the moment is increasingly difficult. Militarily, it faces a growing American presence at sea. Economically, it faces the threat of deeper disruption to its oil exports, especially those linked to China. Diplomatically, it now risks being seen as the side unwilling or unable to move serious talks forward. Yet, Tehran may still believe time is on its side, or that pressure can be absorbed long enough to force concessions later. For the United States, the challenge is to translate pressure into results without triggering a wider conflict. That balance is never easy. Too little pressure can invite defiance. Too much pressure can close the door to diplomacy altogether. Right now, Washington appears to believe that stronger leverage is the only language likely to produce movement. What happens next may depend on whether indirect channels begin producing concrete signals. If Pakistan carries messages between Tehran and Washington, and if those messages include real proposals on enrichment, uranium removal, maritime conduct, or sanctions relief, then diplomacy may still have a path forward. But if the messages remain vague, defiant, or purely tactical, then the current trend points toward more pressure, more military signaling, and a harder line on every front. For now, the immediate picture is clear. The expected trip is off. The direct meeting is not happening. President Donald Trump has drawn a line, saying there will be no more long flights just to sit around and talk. He says the United States holds the advantage, and that if Iran wants a conversation, the phone is open. And until Tehran decides whether it is prepared to move beyond rhetoric, the region will remain on edge, with diplomacy paused, pressure rising, and every side watching for what comes next.